What if one of the world's richest men walked into a restaurant disguised as someone with nothing? When Elon Musk went undercover as a homeless man, no one recognized him. But what happened next exposed a shocking truth about human nature. Would he be treated with dignity or thrown out like an outcast? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Elon Musk sat in his office, staring at the city skyline through the massive glass windows. The world outside was alive with movement, people rushing from one destination to another, cars honking, neon lights flashing in rhythmic pulses. Billionaire, innovator, and disruptor. Those were the words people often used to describe him. Yet tonight those labels would vanish. Tonight he would become someone no one recognized. The idea had been festering in his mind for weeks. It had started as a simple conversation about human nature, how society treated those who appeared to have nothing. He had heard stories, seen headlines about the cruelty the less fortunate faced, but he wanted to witness it firsthand. Would people show kindness when they thought no one was watching, or would they let their judgments dictate their actions? There was only one way to find out. A small team had worked on his transformation: an old pair of scuffed sneakers, faded jeans from a thrift store, and a jacket with frayed edges. The finishing touch was a wig, tangled and slightly greasy looking, and a subtle layer of makeup that deepened the lines on his face. When he looked in the mirror, he no longer saw Elon Musk, the man who made headlines for sending rockets into space or reshaping the auto industry. He saw a stranger. A sense of anticipation coursed through him as he grabbed the final piece of his disguise, an old duffel bag containing nothing but a couple of battered notebooks and a tattered hoodie. He didn't need to go over the plan again. He already knew exactly where he was going. The Copper Elm, an upscale restaurant in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a place where the elite dined on fine wine and dry-aged steaks. It was known for its exclusivity, the kind of establishment where a person's worth was often judged by the cut of their suit or the brand of their watch. If there was anywhere to test society's perception of status, it was there. Elon took a deep breath before stepping out of his office and into the sleek black SUV waiting for him downstairs. His usual driver was absent. Tonight, he had opted for a rideshare service. He wanted to experience this as any ordinary man would. The driver barely spared him a glance when he got in, too focused on the navigation screen to acknowledge the disheveled man in his back seat. The city blurred past, headlights streaking across rain-slicked streets. With every mile, Elon felt himself sinking deeper into his role. By the time they pulled up to the restaurant's entrance, he was no longer the CEO of Tesla and SpaceX. He was just another nameless figure, stepping out onto the pavement with hesitant steps. He stood before the Copper Elm's grand entrance, its golden glow spilling out through the large windows. Inside, he could see elegantly dressed patrons sipping wine, engaged in quiet conversation over candlelit tables. The contrast between his worn-out attire and the pristine luxury before him couldn't have been starker. He adjusted the strap of his duffel bag and reached for the door handle. His fingers hesitated for the briefest moment. Would they let him in? With a deep breath, he pulled the door open and stepped inside. The reaction was immediate. A hush fell over the room, subtle but undeniable. Forks clinked against plates, and the gentle hum of conversation faltered as heads turned in his direction. Though no one openly said a word, their expression spoke volumes. A man like him did not belong here. The air suddenly felt heavier, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. He took a few steps forward, his shoes scuffing against the polished hardwood floor. His heart pounded, not out of nervousness, but because he was already seeing the answers he had come looking for. A hostess dressed in sleek black approached him. Her professional smile barely masked her uncertainty. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but strained. Elon kept his expression calm, measured. "Yes, a table for one, please." The hostess hesitated, her eyes flicking to the bar where a man in a pressed suit, presumably the manager, watched with a calculating stare. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "We're fully booked tonight." Elon glanced around. Several tables remained noticeably empty, their untouched silverware gleaming under the chandeliers. The lie was evident. He didn't challenge her. He simply stood there, waiting. For the first time in years, he felt invisible, not because he was hiding, but because they wanted to pretend he wasn't there. And that was exactly why he had come. His experiment had officially begun. The copper elm, with its polished floors and dim golden lighting, felt like a world separate from the one outside. Everything inside was carefully curated. The crystal-clear wine glasses, the hushed tones of conversation, the quiet elegance of candlelight reflecting against fine china. It was an atmosphere built on exclusivity, a place where money wasn't just expected, it was a silent prerequisite. And right now, Elon Musk did not fit the image. The hostess stood stiffly before him, her perfectly trained smile faltering as she kept her hands folded in front of her. She was waiting for him to accept the lie she had just told him. "We're fully booked tonight," she had said. And yet Elon could see the truth in plain sight. A row of empty tables sat just beyond her shoulder, untouched. The restaurant wasn't overflowing with patrons. In fact, the dinner rush had yet to begin. There was space. There was room. But the problem wasn't a lack of seating. The problem was him. Elon studied her for a moment. He could see the conflict in her eyes. She wasn't outright rude, but there was discomfort in her posture, an unspoken understanding that a man dressed like him didn't belong here. The decision to turn him away wasn't necessarily her own, but she wasn't going to fight it. A tense silence hung between them, stretching longer than either of them expected. Behind the hostess, a manager stood by the bar, pretending to polish a glass but making no effort to hide the way he was watching the exchange. His gaze was cold, calculating. He wasn't coming over, wasn't interfering, because he didn't need to. He had already made his decision the moment Elon had stepped through the doors. "I can seat him." The voice came from the other side of the room. It was a young server, Sophia. Elon turned toward her, and for the first time that evening he saw someone whose expression wasn't clouded with suspicion. She had kind brown eyes, a warmth to her presence that felt like a stark contrast to the tension around them. She wasn't much older than 24, her auburn hair neatly tied back in a ponytail. The hostess hesitated, glancing toward the manager for silent approval. He narrowed his eyes, but before he could shake his head, Sophia was already grabbing a menu and walking toward Elon. "Right this way, sir." The room was still frozen in a state of unease, but Sophia ignored the glances being exchanged as she led Elon to the back of the restaurant, near the kitchen doors. It wasn't the best table, far from it. But it was a table. Elon followed quietly, the soft hum of disapproving whispers trailing in his wake. As he sat down, he could feel the weight of every stare on his back. Conversations that had previously flowed with ease had slowed. The diners were trying to be subtle, but the curiosity in their eyes was impossible to hide. What is he doing here? Why did she seat him? Elon leaned back in his chair, observing the silent spectacle he had unknowingly become. It was fascinating how quickly the energy in the restaurant had shifted the moment he had walked in. Sophia placed the menu in front of him, her voice steady. "Take your time. Can I get you something to drink while you decide?" Elon looked up at her. There was no judgment in her expression, no hesitation. If anything, she seemed completely unfazed by the quiet storm he had caused. "Just water, please," he said, offering a small smile. She nodded, returning the smile before walking away. At the bar, the manager was still watching. His jaw was tight, his grip firm around the glass he was still pretending to clean. He was unhappy, not because of Elon's presence, but because Sophia had broken the unspoken rule of places like this. You don't serve people who don't fit the image. As Elon glanced around the restaurant, he could hear the hushed whispers. "Do you think he's homeless? He's probably going to ask for something for free. I don't know why they let people like that in here." Elon remained composed, his expression unreadable, but his mind was already processing everything. Every reaction, every shift in body language, he was taking mental notes, recording the way judgment revealed itself in the smallest, most subtle ways. Sophia returned with his glass of water, setting it down gently in front of him. "Have you decided on your order?" she asked. Elon flipped through the menu, though he already knew what he wanted. He wasn't here to dine lavishly, he was here to observe. "Just soup and bread," he said simply. Sophia raised an eyebrow. "That's all?" "That's all." She didn't argue. She simply nodded, writing it down before disappearing into the kitchen. But others weren't as accepting. At a table near the center of the room, a man in an expensive navy blue suit scoffed, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to his dining companion. "What kind of place lets someone like that sit here?" His companion, a woman in an elegant black dress, leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as if Elon was some kind of dangerous presence. "I don't feel comfortable with this." And that was the thought Elon found most interesting. Not disgust, not outright cruelty, discomfort. His presence alone was enough to make people uneasy, not because he had done anything, not because he had asked for anything, but simply because he existed in a place where they believed he didn't belong. And that realization spoke louder than any insult ever could. The restaurant, once lively and refined, now felt suffocating with its judgment. And Elon had only just begun. Elon sat in the corner of the copper elm, his presence still a lingering disturbance in the atmosphere. The tension in the restaurant had not faded, it had thickened, like an unspoken storm hanging in the air. Though no one spoke directly to him, he could hear the murmurs, feel the wary glances, and sense the discomfort radiating from nearby tables. Sophia, the only beacon of warmth in the room, reappeared at his side, carefully setting down a steaming bowl of tomato bisque and a small basket of bread. She treated him no differently than she would any other guest, her service impeccable, her demeanor unwaveringly professional. "Enjoy your meal," she said, offering a sincere smile. Elon returned the smile, a quiet appreciation in his eyes. He wasn't just observing the restaurant, he was observing her. She had made a choice tonight, one that had set her apart from everyone else in the room. As he lifted the spoon, he could still hear snippets of conversation drifting from nearby tables. "I don't understand why they let him in," one man muttered under his breath. "Probably some kind of scam artist," his wife responded. At the bar, the manager leaned in close to one of the senior servers, his expression taut with disapproval. "Keep an eye on him," he instructed in a hushed tone. "If he causes trouble or makes anyone uncomfortable, I want him gone." The server nodded, but Elon caught the way her lips pursed, the small flicker of hesitation. Not everyone was comfortable with the outright dismissal of another human being, but compliance was easier than confrontation. Sophia moved swiftly between tables, carrying trays of wine and entrees to the restaurant's high-profile guests. Even as she worked, Elon could tell she was aware of the attention on them. She saw the disapproving glares, heard the whispered judgments, but she never wavered. Then it happened. At a nearby table, a well-dressed couple exchanged a glance before calling her over. The woman, with her manicured nails tapping lightly against the tablecloth, offered a polite but icy smile. "Excuse me, dear," she said, her voice sweetened with artificial kindness. "I just have to ask, why are you serving him?" Sophia blinked, caught off guard. She straightened slightly, regaining her composure. "I serve all customers, ma'am." "Right," the woman said, glancing at Elon as if he were an insect that had landed on her table. "But this is a fine establishment. Shouldn't we be mindful of the ambiance?" Her husband, a man in his late 50s with a gold watch gleaming on his wrist, smirked over his glass of scotch. "I just think it's bad for business," he added, shaking his head. "Not exactly the kind of clientele you want to attract." Sophia's fingers curled slightly against the edge of her tray, but she remained composed. "With all due respect, sir, he's a paying customer like anyone else." The man scoffed. "Does he?" A sharp silence followed. Elon, who had been listening the entire time, slowly set down his spoon. He met the couple's eyes, holding their gaze steadily. "Would it be easier if I left?" he asked, his voice calm but piercing. The woman shifted uncomfortably, suddenly caught in the trap of her own condescension. She hadn't expected him to address her, hadn't expected him to challenge her veiled insult. Sophia's voice cut through the tension, unwavering. "No, sir," she said, her words not just directed at Elon but at the entire room. "You're welcome here." A flicker of surprise crossed the manager's face from across the restaurant. This was not how he expected the conversation to go. The couple, sensing that they were suddenly the ones being judged, exchanged a final glance before looking away. Their power in the situation had dissolved the moment Sophia had refused to play along. Elon took a slow sip of his water, watching as Sophia walked away without hesitation, her shoulders squared, her decision final. It was rare, he thought, to see someone choose integrity when surrounded by people willing to abandon it. But this was just the beginning. Because what the restaurant didn't know, what none of them could possibly suspect, was that their judgment had been directed at one of the most powerful men in the world. And soon they would learn that the real test had only just begun. The air in the Copper Elm was thick with tension, the kind that settled into the very walls and refused to dissipate. Though the restaurant maintained its usual elegance, the soft hum of conversation, the clinking of silverware against porcelain, there was an undeniable undercurrent of unease. Sophia, still shaken from her earlier confrontation with the wealthy couple, forced herself to stay focused. She had worked in customer service long enough to know that people with money often assumed they held power over those serving them. But tonight felt different. She glanced toward the corner where Elon Musk, still in his carefully crafted disguise, sat quietly. He seemed unbothered by the stares, the whispers, the thinly veiled contempt. But Sophia saw deeper than that. There was an intensity in his eyes, a quiet observation that suggested he was absorbing every moment. Then the breaking point came. The manager, a man named Daniel Price, had been watching everything from behind the bar. His disapproval had been growing, his patience thinning. To him, the Copper Elm was more than just a restaurant. It was a brand, a status symbol for the elite. The presence of someone like Elon, dressed as a homeless man, disrupted that image. With a deep breath, Daniel finally made his move. He strode across the floor, his polished shoes clicking against the marble tiles, his face carefully composed. Stopping just beside Sophia, who was refilling a glass of wine at a nearby table, he placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Sophia," he said in a voice low enough that only she could hear, "I need to talk to you. Now." Sophia stiffened but nodded, setting down the wine bottle and following him toward the side of the restaurant near the staff entrance. She could feel the weight of curious eyes trailing after them. Once they were out of earshot of the diners, Daniel turned to face her, his jaw tight. "I don't know what game you think you're playing," he began, his voice laced with irritation, "but this, whatever this is, it stops now." Sophia frowned. "I don't understand." Daniel exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose before looking at her again. "Yes, you do," he said. "You've been going out of your way to accommodate him, and it's making people uncomfortable. Our guests come here expecting a certain level of clientele." A sick feeling churned in Sophia's stomach. "A certain level of clientele?" she repeated, her voice dangerously calm. Daniel's expression didn't waver. "Look, I don't make the rules, but I enforce them," he said. "We're running a business, not a charity. So, here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop giving him special treatment, and when he's finished with his meal, I expect you to encourage him to leave. Understood?" Sophia's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she considered staying quiet, keeping her head down. But something inside her snapped. "With all due respect, sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength with every word, "I treat all customers the same. I don't see how being polite and professional is special treatment." Daniel's eyes darkened. "You're being difficult, Sophia," he warned. She squared her shoulders. "No, sir," she said, her voice unwavering now. "I'm just doing my job." For a long moment they stared at each other, an unspoken battle raging between them. Then Daniel exhaled sharply and shook his head. "Fine," he said, his voice cold. "But don't expect me to clean up the mess when this backfires." Without waiting for her response, he turned and walked away, his frustration evident in the stiffness of his posture. Sophia let out a shaky breath. Her heart was racing, her hands trembling, but she didn't regret standing her ground. Then, as if sensing her distress, a familiar voice spoke behind her. "That was brave." Sophia turned sharply. Elon was standing there, his expression unreadable. She blinked, her pulse still erratic from the confrontation. You saw that?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Elon nodded. "Hard to miss," he said. His eyes studied her carefully. "You didn't have to do that. Most people wouldn't have." Sophia let out a short, breathless laugh. "I've never been good at looking the other way," she admitted. Elon's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. "That's rare," he said, his voice carrying a weight Sophia didn't fully understand. Before she could respond, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted again. Daniel had returned to the floor, but this time he wasn't alone. A security guard had entered the restaurant, and he was walking straight toward Elon's table. The atmosphere in the Copper Elm grew thick with tension as the security guard, a tall, imposing man with a shaved head and a rigid stance, strode toward Elon Musk's table. The polished floors seemed to echo beneath his heavy boots, the weight of his purpose undeniable. Sophia stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. She had known something like this might happen. She had felt it in the way the other servers whispered, in the way Daniel's eyes had burned with frustration. But watching it unfold in real time sent a cold shiver down her spine. Elon, still in his disguise, didn't flinch. He simply folded his hands on the table, his gaze calm, almost expectant. The hush that had fallen over the restaurant was deafening. Every patron, every staff member seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see how this would end. The security guard stopped just a few feet from the table, his voice gruff but controlled. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." A beat of silence. Elon tilted his head slightly, as if considering the request. "May I ask why?" he replied, his voice soft but firm. The guard hesitated, glancing toward Daniel Price, who stood near the bar, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Management's request," the guard finally said. Sophia felt anger surge through her chest. This was wrong, and everyone knew it. Elon, however, remained unfazed. He let out a small breath, as if he had already expected this outcome. "I see," he murmured. Then, in a move that caught everyone off guard, he slowly stood. The guard stepped back slightly, surprised by the smoothness of his motion. There was something about him, something powerful, despite the rags he wore. Then Elon turned his gaze toward Sophia, and for a brief moment she swore she saw something shift in his expression, a silent understanding, a shared moment of realization. And then he spoke again. "Before I go, I have a question." The room remained eerily still. Even Daniel, who had been so eager to see him gone, didn't interrupt. Elon gestured toward the tables of well-dressed patrons, toward the chandeliers that cast their warm, golden glow over the exclusivity of the restaurant. "This is a place of luxury, isn't it?" he asked. A few heads nodded, uncertain. "People come here expecting to be treated with dignity, to enjoy good food, good service." He let the words settle. "And yet, the moment someone walks in who doesn't fit the mold, that dignity disappears." A ripple of discomfort passed through the crowd. People shifted in their seats. Some avoided eye contact. Others looked outright annoyed. Daniel scoffed, stepping forward. "That's enough," he snapped. "This is private property, and we have the right to refuse service to anyone." Elon turned his full attention to him now, his expression unreadable. "And what exactly was I refused for?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Daniel faltered for a split second before regaining his composure. "Look at you," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You don't belong here. This isn't the place for people like you." Sophia's heart pounded. She wanted to scream. The cruelty in Daniel's words was more than just an insult. It was a reflection of how society treated people based on nothing but appearance. Then Elon smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile, it was knowing, sharp, inevitable. And then, in one fluid motion, he reached up and pulled off his wig. Gasps rippled through the room. The unkempt beard, the carefully placed makeup, the disguise that had shielded his identity, it all fell away, and in its place stood one of the most recognizable men in the world. Elon Musk. A murmur of shock spread like wildfire. Diners who had whispered behind their napkins now gawked openly. A woman near the front audibly gasped, clutching her husband's arm. The servers, including the ones who had looked down on him earlier, looked horrified. And Daniel? He was frozen. Sophia's breath hitched. She had known something was off about the man sitting in that booth. His confidence, his composure. It all made sense now. He had never been just another customer. He had been watching. Elon let the room sit in stunned silence for a moment before he spoke again. "Tell me, Mr. Price," he said smoothly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that sent a chill through the room. "Do I still not belong here?" Daniel swallowed hard. For the first time, he looked unsure. The power in the room had shifted, and Elon Musk was standing right at the center of it. The silence that followed Elon Musk's reveal was suffocating. The weight of his identity, now exposed, hung in the air like a thundercloud about to burst. Every pair of eyes in the copper elm was locked onto him, wide with disbelief. Seconds felt like hours. Daniel Price, the restaurant's manager, looked as if he had been physically struck. His confident posture had vanished, replaced by rigid, stunned stillness. The color drained from his face. The man he had just insulted, dismissed, and ordered out of his establishment was one of the most powerful and influential figures in the world. A billionaire, a visionary, a name that had become synonymous with innovation. Elon took a slow step forward, his gaze never leaving Daniel's. The manager flinched but held his ground, though his hands curled into fists at his sides. He was trapped, cornered by his own words, his own actions. "Now," Elon said, his voice calm yet sharp, "do I still not belong here?" A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Some diners looked down at their plates, as if ashamed of what they had witnessed. Others stole glances at Daniel, waiting for his response. The staff servers who had laughed behind Elon's back, who had whispered about him being a waste of space, stood frozen, their expressions a mixture of guilt and shock. Daniel swallowed, forcing himself to speak, but his voice cracked. "Mr. Musk, I had no idea." "That shouldn't matter," Elon interrupted, tilting his head. "Why should my identity change how you treat me?" Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came. There was nothing he could say. Elon turned, addressing the entire restaurant now. "Tonight, you all proved something," he said, scanning the room. "You proved that status, wealth, and appearances dictate how we treat people." His voice, though steady, carried an unmistakable edge of disappointment. "Had I walked in here in a suit, you would have catered to me, wouldn't you?" No one dared to answer. They didn't have to. The answer was written all over their faces. Sophia, who had been standing near the bar, her tray still clutched in her hands, watched the scene unfold with a pounding heart. She had suspected something about him was different, but never in her wildest dreams had she imagined this. She had stood up for him, defended him, not knowing he was a billionaire, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Now she felt a wave of heat rise in her cheeks as Elon turned his gaze toward her. "But one person," he continued, his expression softening slightly, "saw something the rest of you refused to." He motioned for Sophia to step forward. Her pulse quickened, and she hesitated for a brief second, before slowly walking toward him. The room held its collective breath. "You didn't know who I was," Elon said, looking her in the eyes. "You didn't need to. You treated me with dignity, with respect. You gave me kindness when it would have been easier to ignore me. And for that," he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Sophia blinked, confused, as he handed it to her. "Open it," he encouraged. With shaking hands, she carefully tore the envelope's edge and pulled out the contents. A handwritten note and a check. A $50,000 check? Gasps echoed throughout the restaurant. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as her vision blurred with tears. Her hands trembled as she read the note. "Sophia, thank you for being the kind of person this world desperately needs. Use this to follow your dreams. Culinary school, your own restaurant, whatever you choose. The world needs more people like you. Elon Musk." Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. She had spent her life working tirelessly, dreaming of a future she could barely afford, sacrificing every comfort to make ends meet. And now, standing here in front of the very man she had unknowingly defended, she realized that her simple act of kindness had changed the course of her life. She looked up at Elon, struggling to find the right words. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say nothing," Elon replied gently. "Just keep being the person you are." Sophia wiped at her eyes and nodded. She would never forget this moment, nor would she waste the opportunity she had been given. But Elon wasn't done. He turned back to Daniel Price, who still looked like a man who had just lost everything. "As for this restaurant," Elon continued, "let this be a lesson." Daniel straightened, trying to salvage what little dignity he had left. "Of course, Mr. Musk," he said hastily. We will be making changes, I assure you." "Good," Elon said simply. The tension in the room remained heavy, but it had shifted. Now it was filled not just with shame, but with reflection. Elon took one last look around. The people who had once sneered at him, who had whispered behind their menus, now looked uncertain, some embarrassed, others deep in thought. And then, with a final nod to Sophia, he turned and walked toward the exit. The door closed behind him, leaving behind a room full of people who had just learned a lesson they would never forget. The door to the Copper Elm had barely swung shut behind Elon Musk, but the impact of his revelation still reverberated through the restaurant like an aftershock. The weight of shame and realization hung heavy in the air. The once lively conversations had been replaced with murmurs, hushed whispers and guilty glances exchanged between diners. Many of them had spent the evening sneering, judging, or outright dismissing the man they thought was beneath them, only to realize they had just humiliated one of the most influential minds in the world. The manager, Daniel Price, stood rigid, his mind racing as he processed what had just unfolded. He had lost control of the situation, lost control of his own carefully curated image as a respected restaurant manager, and now his establishment, his career, and his reputation hung by a thread. Across the room, Sophia still clutched the envelope Elon had given her. The reality of what had just happened was starting to sink in, but she still felt like she was trapped in a dream. $50,000. $50,000. That was more than she had ever made in a year. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for. Her hands trembled, the check suddenly feeling heavier than anything she had ever. Her co-workers stared at her, their eyes wide with a mix of jealousy and awe. The same servers who had whispered about Elon earlier, the same ones who had dismissed Sophia as naive, now looked at her as if she had just unlocked the secret to life. From one of the corner tables, a well-dressed businessman leaned toward his wife, his voice barely above a whisper. "We judged him so quickly," he admitted, shaking his head. "We didn't even think twice about it. And look where it got us." His wife, who had been one of the first to give Elon a disapproving glance, swallowed hard. For the first time, she saw herself clearly, and she didn't like what she saw. At another table, an older woman dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. "How many people have I ignored just because of how they looked?" she murmured. It wasn't just guilt, it was introspection. And for many of the patrons that night, it was the first time they had ever been forced to confront their own prejudices. As the tension slowly settled, the staff began returning to their duties, but there was no denying that something had changed. The servers who had laughed at Elon earlier now looked at each other with silent embarrassment. One of them, a young man named Josh, clenched his jaw as he replayed his own behavior in his head. He had muttered, "Waste of space," under his breath when he thought Elon wasn't listening. Now, the shame burned in his gut. Josh approached Sophia, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Hey, that was wild," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. His usual smug confidence had been stripped away. Sophia glanced up at him, still overwhelmed by everything that had happened. "Yeah," she said simply. Josh hesitated, then sighed. "Look, I just wanted to say, you were right. About him, about everything. I should have treated him better." Sophia studied him for a moment before offering a small nod. She wasn't the type to hold grudges, but she wasn't going to let anyone off the hook that easily either. "It shouldn't take someone being famous for you to treat them with kindness, Josh," she said softly. "You don't have to like every customer, but you should at least respect them." Josh looked away, ashamed. "Yeah, I get that now." The Copper Elm staff had always prided themselves on professionalism, but tonight had exposed something deeper, an uncomfortable truth about how they viewed people. And now, they couldn't ignore it. Daniel Price knew he had to act fast. The night had been a disaster for him. He had dismissed a billionaire in front of a packed restaurant. The damage to his reputation and to the restaurant itself could be catastrophic. He approached Sophia, his usual arrogance dimmed. "Sophia," he said, forcing a smile, "listen, about tonight. I think we need to have a talk about, your future here." Sophia blinked, caught off guard. "My future?" she echoed. Yes, Daniel nodded quickly. "Clearly you have something special. I mean, Elon Musk himself recognized your kindness. That says a lot. I think we should consider promoting you, maybe even putting you in charge of customer service training. We could really use someone like you in a leadership role." Sophia stared at him. The hypocrisy of it all was almost laughable. This was the same man who had refused to let Elon sit down, the same man who had told her to focus on the right customers. And now, because Elon had recognized her, Daniel suddenly saw her value. Sophia took a deep breath, gripping the check in her hand. "I appreciate the offer," she said slowly, "but I don't think I'll be working here much longer." Daniel's smile faltered. "What?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't where I belong anymore," Sophia said, and for the first time in years, she felt truly free. She had spent months, years working tirelessly hoping someone would notice her efforts, hoping for a break. And now she had it. Not because of luck, but because she had stayed true to who she was. Daniel looked at her in disbelief. He had spent so long dismissing her potential that he had never once considered that she might outgrow the restaurant before it outgrew her. As the night wound down, Sophia quietly gathered her things. The check was carefully tucked into her bag, but it wasn't just the money that made her feel lighter. It was the realization that her life had just changed forever. She turned back toward the restaurant one last time. The place that had been her entire world for so long suddenly felt small. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She was just ready. And as she stepped out into the cool night air, she took a deep breath and smiled. Somewhere out there, Elon Musk had walked away from the restaurant, leaving behind a ripple effect that would be felt for years to come. And Sophia? She was finally walking toward the future she had always deserved. The night at the Copper Elm might have ended, but the story was only beginning. By the next morning, the entire restaurant staff, along with many of the patrons who had been present, found themselves facing an unexpected storm, one that swept across social media like wildfire. A single tweet from Elon Musk ignited the internet. "Last night I learned a lot about people, about judgment, about kindness. One person in a restaurant full of people showed true character. One person saw beyond appearances. We need more people like Sophia." Attached to the tweet was a simple photo, a folded napkin with the words, "Kindness is the only true currency." By the time Sophia woke up that morning, her phone was flooded with messages, notifications, and missed calls. Friends, co-workers, complete strangers. Everyone had something to say. Some congratulated her, others wanted interviews, and some were simply reaching out to share their own experiences of being judged based on appearances. Still groggy, she scrolled through article after article. Elon Musk tests humanity in social experiment. The waitress who passed Elon Musk's test with flying colors. A $50,000 lesson in kindness. Sophia's stomach twisted as she read. She hadn't done anything special, at least that's how she saw it. She had simply treated someone with respect. But as she continued scrolling, it became clear just how rare that was. Meanwhile, Daniel Price, the restaurant's manager, sat in his office, his face pale as he read the endless stream of headlines. The phone had not stopped ringing all morning. Some people called to praise the restaurant for hiring someone like Sophia. Others called to demand why a high-end establishment had treated Elon Musk so poorly. One particularly angry caller said, "I was a regular at the Copper Elm. I won't be coming back to a place that treats people like dirt." Daniel clenched his fists. He had built this restaurant's reputation over the years, priding himself on its exclusivity, its clientele, and now everything was crumbling. He glanced toward the dining floor, where a few early customers sat, whispering about last night's events. The same staff who had sneered at Elon Musk just hours ago now moved with nervous energy, as if they were all waiting for the consequences to crash down. Daniel knew he had to do something, but what could he possibly say? Sophia hesitated before stepping outside. It was supposed to be a normal morning. She had expected to wake up, make a cup of coffee, and maybe take a walk. Instead, she was suddenly the center of a national conversation. By the time she arrived at the restaurant to pick up her final paycheck, reporters were waiting outside. "Miss Sophia, can you tell us what Elon Musk said to you after the experiment? Did you know it was him? What are you going to do with the money?" The questions bombarded her from every angle. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't a public figure. She was just a waitress. She felt her breath quicken until she heard a familiar voice. "Give her space." It was Josh, one of the servers, who had doubted her the night before. His face was pale with guilt, but his voice was firm. He had seen firsthand what Sophia had done and what the rest of them had failed to do. Sophia exhaled slowly and faced the cameras. "I just did what any decent person should do," she said simply. That's all. But she knew deep down that this was bigger than her. Later that day, as Sophia sat in her tiny apartment, sipping a now cold cup of coffee, her phone buzzed again. But this time, it wasn't a news alert. It was an email. From Elon Musk. Subject: The future. She hesitated before opening it. "Sophia," it read, "you didn't just pass a test last night. You proved that kindness isn't a performance. It's who you are. People like you deserve opportunities, not just luck. If you're serious about culinary school, I'd like to personally help fund the rest of your education and introduce you to some of the best chefs in the country. Let me know if you're interested. No strings attached, just gratitude." Sophia's hands shook as she read it. She had never even dared to dream this big. Her eyes drifted toward the check still sitting on the kitchen counter, and suddenly she knew exactly what she was going to do. She grabbed her phone and typed out a response. "Thank you, Mr. Musk. I'm ready for what's next." As news of the experiment spread, people everywhere started questioning their own actions. How many times had they looked down on someone because of how they looked? How many times had they dismissed someone without really seeing them? The lesson Elon Musk had hoped to teach had gone far beyond the walls of the Copper Elm. And Sophia, the waitress who had simply treated a man with dignity, had become a symbol of what true kindness looked like. In the end, the world didn't just see Elon Musk in disguise. They saw themselves. At its core, this story isn't just about Elon Musk's undercover experiment. It's about how we, as a society, treat others based on appearances. Too often we judge before we know. We assume before we understand. But true character isn't revealed in moments of comfort. It's tested in how we treat those who seemingly have nothing to offer us. Tafia's kindness was a simple act, yet it carried a powerful message. Respect should never be conditional. In today's world, where status and wealth often dictate perception, we must remember that compassion costs nothing, but means everything. If this story resonated with you, don't just keep it to yourself. Spread the message. Like this video, subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness, in the end, is the most valuable currency of all. Let's make the world a little better, one story at a time.